Now we're going to get into a few bishop versus knight endgames. This one was played in an action tournament in the Marshall Chess Club in New York, 1996. My opponent is one of the great landmarks in American chess. Bonin is an international master who seems to play in every single chess tournament in New York City. He's probably the most active tournament player in America, sometimes even playing 2 or 3 tournaments simultaneously. And he's always a tough guy to meet. Jay's an excellent tactician with a wonderful intuitive feeling for certain types of positions. He's a good technical endgame player, but sometimes he's a little impatient. Jay and I have played countless tournament games over the years, and they're always exciting. Take a look at this position first of all. Before I say anything, what do you think of it? Well, I'm sure you've noticed some differences. First of all, I, as white, have a bishop. He has a knight. I have an outside passed pawn on a4. His passed pawn on c6 is a little closer to the action. One of the key advantages of a bishop over a knight in the endgame is that if the play is on both sides of the board, the bishop can cover distances much more easily and quickly. On the other hand, a knight can cover both dark and light squares. A bishop, this one for example, can only cover light squares. That understood. What is my best move? In a number of the earlier endgames in this course, my first move was a structural decision. Here once again I tie his pawns down to light squares. My first move is f4, a very important decision. Now his f5, g6, and h7 pawns will always be weaknesses. If he had gotten in f4, and then say somehow g5 and h6, now my bishop would have been limited by my own pawns, and his pawns wouldn't have been vulnerable. I played f4. He played knight a5. He has to maintain control of the a5 square, but he shouldn't give up his king's position. My bishop can't drive the king out of c5, and if he goes back, then I can get into d4 or b4. Knight a5 is a good move. But here I missed a key idea. I should have immediately gotten aggressive. I had the idea of bishop b3, aiming for his weaknesses. If he plays knight takes b3, then after king takes b3, the fact that I have an outside passed pawn should be very good for the win. Eventually, his king will have to come to the outside. And when he takes my outside pawn, and I take his c6 pawn, it seems that I'm a little closer to the king side than him. This is one of the advantages of having an outside passed pawn. I should be ahead in the race east. I didn't come to such a specific conclusion. I saw he wanted to play knight c4, so I stopped it with bishop d3. I maintained the tension. My bishop versus knight is an advantage. I left it how it was. He played knight back to b7, and now I began my kingside play, h3. Another plan for me would have been again to play bishop back to b1 all the way, followed by bishop a2 and bishop g8. If I play bishop b1, he plays knight a5, for example. Then after bishop a2, if he goes back, then I have bishop g8, and if he plays h6, then bishop h7. He can't defend all of his pawns. If g5 moves, I take the f5 pawn. This would have been a very good plan, but frankly I didn't see it. I was focused on creating a second weakness. The key theme we're going to be looking into in this example and the following ones is the principle of two weaknesses. A lot of the time, the defender can successfully handle one weakness, but if you create something else on the opposite side of the board that he has to deal with, his defense can't hold up. I played h3. His first weakness is my a4 pawn. His second weakness, potentially, will be my passed f pawn, after, for instance, g4, the trade, and f5. 2 passed pawns to deal with instead of 1. He played knight a5. Obviously, he's just playing for a draw, repeating moves, keeping control of the a5 square. I played g4, f takes g4, h takes g4, king d5. Now, you might have thought that he could play for the outside passed pawn himself, h5. This would be a mistake. What do you do for white now? While it's true if I play g takes h5, g takes h5, he'll have gained an outside passed pawn, and my f pawn is pretty close to his king. If you recall the idea of the square, even if I play f5, he's still within the square of the pawn. This would be a mistake for me. The correct solution would be the tactical move, f5. Very strong. And now he has big problems. Because if he plays g takes f5, then after g takes h5, I'm the one with the outside passed pawn, and he can't handle that one. If he plays h takes g4, then after f takes g6, my pawn is almost queened, and I win. So h5 would be a mistake for him. He played king d5, and I immediately took advantage of the square being lost. King b4, knight b7, a5. And here my opponent made a critical mistake. Now you'll notice the relationship between my pawn and his knight. If I succeed in playing a6, he won't be able to stop the pawn. If you take away all the pieces, for example, and look on an empty board, if I play a6, there's no way for his knight to cover the a8 square in time. He realized that, and he made the logical decision to sacrifice knight for pawn and then play in the center for his own passed pawns. He played knight takes a5. Remember this position. We'll come back to it. After knight takes a5, king takes a5. My king is temporarily out of the game. Now notice he's the one with the central king, but I'm up a piece. He played h5. How would you play with white? I created a wall against his king. I played g takes h5, g takes h5, bishop f5. A very important idea. In this type of position, when you're defending against a passed pawn with a bishop, and also defending one of your own pawns, the key is to make it all happen on one diagonal. This is the essence of the position. Bishop f5 creates a wall against his king, but also it prepares the moves bishop h3, king e4, f5. If his king goes after my bishop, then he can no longer defend the queening pawn, f6, f7, f8. If the king remains on e5, then I'll simply take his c-pawn with my king, bring my king over, take his h-pawn, and win the game. After bishop f5, he has big problems. He played king d4, and I played bishop h3. Now he saw, of course, that after king e4, f5, he's all roped in, nothing he can do. He decided to push the other pawn, c5, but I had calculated this out. f5. Now again, if we return to king e5, then king b5 will win the game easily. He played c4, f6, c3, and now bishop f5, defending the c2 square. If his pawn had been on h4, things could have been more interesting. He would have h3, and my bishop is overloaded. If I take the h3 pawn, he plays c2 and c1, and if I just queen, he makes a queen. The position will be tough to win. But he was one tempo behind. After bishop f5, he played king e5, f7, king takes f5, f8, queen check. And we already know from our study of queen against pawn endgames that this is winning. He played king g4. I just played queen g7 check. King h3, queen takes c3 check, and he resigned. If his pawn had been on h2 and his king on g1, this would have been a draw, but his pawn is way too far back, and I win easily. So do you notice how important just one tempo was in this endgame? How in these complicated variations, my win completely depended upon perfect timing. Is there any moment in his defense when black could have gained a tempo? Details are very important. Let's go back. When I played the move a5, he immediately played knight takes a5. Do you see a way for black to gain a tempo? He should have seized the moment and played c5 check first. This might seem like a very small detail, but it could have changed the outcome of the game. I play king b5, and now he takes it. Knight takes a5, king takes a5, and he plays c4. He's moving much faster. I would go back, bishop b1, and now he plays h5. The difference in this position is that his pawn is 2 ranks further up the board. He gained the tempo on my king, and then the tempo on my bishop. After bishop b1, he would play h5. Now I would try g5. He plays h4. He has 2 pawns for me to worry about. I play bishop takes g6. He plays h3. This can get dangerous. I have to stop him from queening. I play bishop h5. Now notice that I'm threatening to queen with check. If he were to play, for instance, c3, then after g6, c2, g7, c1, g8, queen, this is very good for me. Queen and bishop and pawn against queen and king and pawn will be winning. My pawn will prove decisive. Notice, of course, after c3, g6, if he attempts to run back now, king e6, then after g7, my bishop controls the f7 square, and I win. So he can't push the c-pawn, and he also can't push the h-pawn, because then I'll have bishop f3 check, followed by king b4. I stop both pawns, and my pawns will queen. His key move is king e4, which stops the bishop f3 move, and gains a key tempo because I'm no longer queening with check on the g8 square. After king e4, I would put bishop e8. he would play h2, I play g6, and here his critical move is king f5. He's threatening to queen now. If bishop c6, my pawn hangs. I have to play g7. He queens, and I queen. But now the difference is that I'll lose my f4 pawn. He can play king takes f4, and I can choose to play queen takes c4 check, or I can leave that pawn on the board and try to attack him. This position should be a draw. Queen and bishop against queen is too hard to win. So with best defense, if he just noticed all the details of the position, he could have drawn. I want to add one last thing. At one point in this endgame we reached a point where I had bishop and pawn against king. This is almost always winning. In this game it was an f-pawn. This position is easily winning because, as we've learned the opposition, the bishop can be used, if for nothing else, just to lose a tempo. If he plays king f7, I play king e5. His king goes back to e7, I play f6. His king goes back to f8, king e6, king e8. Now of course I can check him if I want. We know that this would be a draw without the bishop, because after f7, king f8, king f6 is stalemate. But with the bishop, I can play f7, f8, and then I can use the bishop to waste a move. Bishop c2. The king has to move away, king g7, king e7. So that if for nothing else, the bishop can be used simply to lose the tempo. A perfect example in which this could be used would be unlikely in practical play, but take a look at it. This position in which the bishops are completely useless, if it were White's move, would be winning, only because White has the option of moving the bishop. The king and pawn endgame is winning. King f4, king f6. I don't have the opposition, but after king g4, king g6, if we return, I can move my bishop, bishop b2, and I force my way to the critical squares after king h6, king f5, and now we know it's winning. And the bishop can be used again and again if it needs to, just to gain the tempo. The bishop is useless but to lose time. But this isn't always the case. There's one critical endgame you need to know. With a rook pawn, the bishop that does not control the queening square is drawing if the defending king can reach the queening square. In other words, in this position, it's a draw. If the black king can get to h8, there's no way for White to win. It wouldn't matter how many bishops White had on light squares. Even this position would be a draw. Black just moves back and forth, back and forth. There's no way to stop it without stalemating. White's king will eventually come up. The king moves back and forth. If the g8 square is guarded by the bishop, then it's stalemate. It doesn't matter how many bishops are on the board. It's a draw. Now, of course, if White were to have a dark square bishop, this would be completely winning, and very easily. The bishop controls this diagonal. The king comes into the game. After king g8, king g6, the king has to move away to f8. And White simply plays h5, h6, h7, makes a queen. On the opposite side of the board, of course, with an a-pawn, a light square bishop is winning because it guards the queening square, and a dark square bishop is drawing because it doesn't, as long as the king is in the corner. This is a very important exception to know. The bishop has to guard the queening square on rook pawns in order for it to be winning endgame.